So the next video, we're essentially moving our way down, as I'd mentioned before. Probably take this row on actually in a later video, just because it's a little more nuanced and involves some of the mapping capabilities of Tableau. But as a way to move down into this one, I'm also going to start to transition a bit more to talking about marks and some of the more creative stuff that you can do. To play with your graphs here. So, in order to show an example, I'm going to take the basic Carnegie classifications, drag it into the row. We can see sort of what each of those are. They let us understand and know the types of different schools. And maybe what we'd want to know is how many different schools are for each, right? Not how many students or employees or whatever, but how many different schools. And so we would think the way to do that would be to take the institution's name and drag it here. But that's not actually right? I mean, it's doing exactly what we asked it to. The problem is it doesn't align with what we expect it to, right? So it's just kind of creating a map so you could see that Abraham, Agricultural College is is a baccalaureate. So in a sense, we actually need a way to reframe this data so that we're not looking at the actual name of the institution, but we're looking at the number of discrete institutions, right? This is something I had sort of mentioned earlier, and it's something that you can do with any field. You can actually create a new field that is totally a calculation based off other fields, and we're going to do this again in a later video. But you get to it in two ways, right? If you know the field you want to calculate off of, you can click that magic button I had mentioned before and do something called create calculated field. Or you can come up here to analysis and do create calculated field, do the same way. So, what if I went here to, the institution name and I said create calculated field. And then first thing it's going to want is a name, so maybe I'll call it discrete vendors because that's what it's going to be. And the neat thing about here is that you don't really need to know the full words. You just kind of have to know like things, right? So if you start typing letters, you'll start to see all the functions that you can do. And those of you who are familiar with Excel, you're going to see many of the same Excel functions that are here. And anytime you type, something that had a name, like that's one of your fields, it's going to come up for you and, it'll tell you what it is and what field it is. So, it's really easy here and it kind of assists you in building out your calculations. But what I'm going to teach you here is one that's called count D. It just means count distinct. And again, if you want to know what something is, you can Google it, learn a little bit more about what it is. And I'll say count distinct institution name. So all I'm doing here is I'm simply counting the discrete number of instances of institution name. It now goes down into my measures here. I think discrete, I don't know if I made it discrete institutions or discrete vendors. Double check real quick. Here we go. Yeah, discrete institutions. And so I can grab that and I can drag it up here to columns. And there we go. Now it's depicting each of these in terms of the discrete number of institutions that are in that category. And I can then, make this a little smaller and see that the top one tends to be masters, college, university, large programs, 365. So, but perhaps I want to make this a more interactive graph. Like maybe it's something ultimately that you're going to publish for people and they're going to want to not only be able to see the size, which is totally fine way to present it here, but then also maybe how many given students or employees are within each of those areas. And that's where the marks really starts coming in handy, right? So I could drag down and find, I'll do total or grand total undergraduate students to start, grand total all students undergraduate, and I'll just drag it up here into the marks. And notice whenever you do a mark, you have several options. Right here, the basic is you just make it the 3 dots, which means it's a detail. And that's what it becomes. It becomes something that you can now see in the table, right? I can now scroll down and actually see the grand total for each of them. I can also try to make it a label. And it'll now pop up at the end, right? It'll tell you the total number that are there, so on and so forth. You can also use different dimensions to further segment this. Like what if I actually wanted to see for each of these, maybe how many were public and how many were private. So maybe I'll drag in control type, for example. and I'll put it in here. Now notice the moment you drag in any kind of dimensional variable here to marks, it begins to sub-segment the data, right? So right now you're not just looking at the Carnegie class, you're looking at Carnegie class by the type. And that's where I can see, okay, these are masters larger programs that are public, and these are masters larger programs that are private, not-for-profit. Right now, right, it just exists in the table, but this is again where you can come in and start playing. What if I change the color? And now, boom, like a new dimension comes onto your map visually, and you can come and you can edit the colors as you need to. The private not-for-profits, maybe those are, like a darker blue, and the public or like a lighter blue or something, just to make it easier. And there you go. Now you've got a map or a visualization that's showing you for each of the Carnegie classifications, essentially how much are public and how much are private. And right, a lot of that is achieved here, again, in your control type. And this can keep going. I'll just do it really quick, but I'm going to delete it in a second. We could, put in historically black college or university as well, and also make that a color. And then, getting even more complex. Now, it reverted back to an original color here, but, anything that is public is orange, and then the shading differentiates whether it's, HCBU. Anything that is private is blue, and then the shading indicates whether it's an HCBU, right? So you can keep kind of growing those trends as much as you need to, or growing those segmentations, rather. So, notice another view kind of opened up for you. That's a tree map, which is one of the more common ones I'm sure you've probably seen Tableau used for in the past. And really what this does is it kind of moves that, bar chart down into a series of blocks and grids. And in order to create this, you need a couple things. The primary thing you need is a sizing element. It just picked this randomly for us. So what it said is, okay, I saw aggregate discrete institutions. I'm going to make that my sizing element. And so what that means is that each of these individual boxes is going to be sized. As you can see, we're going down 31, 27, 26, 12, blah, 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 blah. It's sized by that, right? It's sized by the number of discrete institutions. But I also started segmenting it. I said, also color yourselves up by how many people are there, right? So color yourself so you're getting smaller and smaller, or getting lower shade and lower shade and lower shade as the number of actual programs impacts you. And we can take that out if that's too confusing. And then it'll just go back to one uniform color. How is it segmenting itself? Well, it's segmenting itself first by control type and then by Carnegie classification. So that's why everything over here will say private, right? Private, not for profit. And you see there's this little line here. And then once I get into the line, now I'm at public. Now these are all public, and we're going to go through each of the Carnegie classifications again. I can switch it up. Now I'd be looking, this is private, not-for-profit, public, right? Or this is private, or sorry, a master's university college private. This is a master's university college public. This is a baccalaureate private. This is a baccalaureate public. And you can keep messing around. Maybe I don't need to see the text anymore. Maybe I want this to actually be a color. And so that each of you are depicting yourself, right, whether you are darker blue if you're private and lighter blue if you're public. And that way you say what you are. These are the masters private, these are the masters public. I can get even crazier with it and add colors for this. So now you're going to see just like a ton of variations of shading. Maybe there's even too many colors to be asking of it. So why don't I, maybe take that one and put it back to just a detail. If I don't like the size the way it is, I can make the employees, right, or the total number of students the size, and then doctoral universities' highest research activity jumps to number 1 over the larger programs, right, because there's actually more total number of undergraduate students that were there. So that's a tree map, right? It's something that you control entirely through here, through your choice of how different boxes or different dimensions or different measures are turned into either a color, right? They change the color. A size, they change the size of something. A label, whether or not they appear here, or a detail, right? Something that you would simply click on. Notice under marks, there is a ton of other ways to do marks, and we're not going to get into that for this video. This will be, I think, a much longer term in the future video. But there's many, many different ways to play with your marks and make your data look a little different. I didn't experiment with any of these, and some of this isn't even going to be relevant for the data that I've put in. But if it were relevant, you know, they would show themselves up trying to meet the criteria that you've set for them as best that they can, like a word map or a text map or a pie map or a Gantt map. You know, we'll get into those a bit more strategically later on. So I'm going to stop this video here and start to pick up maybe with the next one with how we start looking at multiple dimensions or multiple measures next to each other and starting to create sort of scatter plots or distributions, and then the more advanced calculations that we might use to support that.